Welcome to the heel flap and turn on long circular needles using magic loop. First of all, I'm just finishing the leg and I'm going to knit these 2 stitches as I come to the last 2 stitches of my last round before I'm ready to start my heel flap. I'm just going to transfer those off because you start at the heel flap in this pattern as you come to the start of round. So now I've removed my marker and I'm ready to go. So the heel flap is worked on half of the stitches in the leg, in this pattern anyway, and in many patterns. So what happens now is it's going to be knit down from the leg of the sock on half of the stitches. So in this case I have 44 stitches in total and I'm going to be knitting it on 22. Depending on the size of pattern you're knitting, you may be knitting more or less stitches than that. So what you're going to do is you're going to get ready to work the round as you would normally. And you just knit that first stitch, keeping it nice and tight in, and then you knit the next number of stitches that you need for your heel flap. So one thing to bear in mind here is that you will just start the round as if you were going to knit a round, but you're going to stop halfway after you've knit the number of stitches to set up your heel flap. And we can talk about that then. So it's just a plain row that you're doing here. So one thing to watch for with them when you're using a magic loop technique is that you don't use all of the stitches automatically that you have on your needle ready to work, because in this case I had 24 because I had been moving the stitches around the cable. So you can pull those back out and put those onto the back of your cable. You are going to leave all of those stitches unworked. They are referred to your instep stitches in the pattern that you're following, and they are unworked. You are now going to work the flap on the front stitches only that are on your needle. So before I begin working back, I put in a removable marker just before the row I've just worked, so into the ridges before that. And what that does is it allows me to easily count the number of stitches that I have in my heel flap and also in the leg of the work. And you'll find that really useful later on. And here you can see one I've done earlier. And this is the marker I placed in an earlier sock. So there it is to count my heel flap stitches, but it's also really useful for counting the stitches, or the rows, excuse me, the rows in the leg. And it's very important to know when you're knitting a sock that you know how many rows so that they can match, although that is not essential. Definitely not something to work yourself up about. So instead of working around and around, we're now going to turn the work and get ready to work back. So you are now going to slip this stitch purlwise. And that is a feature of the heel flap that after you've knit the first row, on all the subsequent rows, you're going to slip the first stitch purlwise. On your purl rows, you slip the stitch purlwise with the yarn held to the front of the work, ready to purl next. And then on your knit rows, and I'll show you that in a second, you slip them purlwise with the yarn in the back. So we're just going to purl across the flap now, back to where we started. And again, that's your 22 stitches, so 1 slipped and 21 worked. And again we get to this point and we turn the work. And again you can see here that you leave the stitches on at the back of your work on the cable unworked. And they are your instep stitches. Just to repeat that because you'll see why that's important in the pattern, because you do a lot with those later on. So again we're going to slip the stitch purlwise with the yarn in back, ready to knit the next stitch. And then again you knit across the stitches and you can see your slip stitches down the side of the work. It becomes much more obvious when you've done a number of rows. So something to say about a heel flap here is this is a stocking stitch heel flap, so it's just a knit row, a purl row. You do see reinforced heels, and that is where some of the stitches in the rows are slipped and then they're purled or knit on the row back, and that thickens the heel flap and that reinforces it. Just turn the work here first and I'll continue saying more about reinforcement in a minute. So again we come to the heel flap, slip the stitch purlwise and work back, and that forms the basis of your heel flap. So all rows will be worked like that once you've started doing the slip stitches on the sides. You'll finish after working a purl row. And just about the reinforcement, with reinforced heels, it's something you either need or don't need. You may not be that hard wearing on your heels, in which case I would suggest wearing your socks around to find out if you are or not before doing it, because it can change how the sock fits in your shoe. So you've finished that, and now you're going to work the heel flap until you have worked all of the rows that it says in the flap. So I'm going to be working 18 rows because I'm working the first size in the DK pattern, and I will be back as soon as I have worked all of those rows. So now you've come to the end of your heel flap and we can talk about what makes it so special. So the first thing you can see is that you can use the marker to count the number of rows in your heel flap. You can do that by counting the ridges on this side, on the back side of the work, or you can count the V's on the front side, depending on which ones you like. So the next thing then with the heel flap is you will see all of your slip stitches down along the side of your heel. So there'll be 9 slip stitches on each side if you've done 18 rows. There'll be half this number of slip stitches for each of the rows that you've done. So I have 18 rows and 9 slip stitches on each side. That's really, it'll become apparent why that is important later on. And that's it. That is your heel flap. The next thing we'll do is we will work the heel turn. And that's where you go from being vertical to being horizontal. And I will be back to talk about that tomorrow. So I will see you for the heel turn tutorial really, really soon. Thank you so much. Hello, welcome to day 3 of the TLYC Sock Challenge using Magic Loop. So we are here now and we have finished the heel flap. We're about to do the heel turn, so going around the bottom of your heel. And that goes out through the center of the heel flap, so that's where it's positioned. So the heel turn is positioned in the center of the heel flap, and that is very, very important. So what I'm going to do first, and the stitches just remain as they were, so you have your instep stitches are still at the back, and you're not going to work them, you're just going to be working this on the heel flap stitches. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to knit 15 stitches, because I'm making the smallest size, and this is in the heel turn part of the pattern that you're following. So I'm going to knit 15 stitches. It's about 3/4 of the way across the heel flap. You're trying to position it just towards the left hand side as you started off. And now you can see here as well that your instep stitches are untouched, just sitting at the back of the work with nothing to do with them at the moment. Just leave them as they are. And you're working this part flat as well. So you knit your 15 stitches and you come to the end, and then what you're going to do is you are going to do a slip slip knit. So the way that's done is you insert your right needle into as knitwise and then do it again to the next stitch, and then you slip those back onto the left hand needle. That's turned them round, so they're sitting differently on the needle, and then you knit into the back of those 2 stitches. That is your first decrease of your heel turn. And you have on the left hand side there you will have 5 unworked stitches. You then turn your work, so it's fine that you have unworked stitches, that's part of it, because you're essentially folding a little bit of the flap back over onto your turn. It's quite interesting how it shapes up. So those are your 5 unworked stitches, and now we're getting to work back. So in this row you're going to slip the first stitch purlwise with the yarn in front, and that is not as key as it was when you were doing the flap, but it's part of the way the heel looks. So you're going to purl 8 stitches having slipped the first one, so there'll be 9 stitches then. Then we're going to fix this because I think I've gone too many. Yep, put that back. So now I have 9 stitches, which I'm supposed to have. So 1 slipped and 8 worked. And then I'm going to purl 2 stitches together. So you go into them purlwise as if to purl, but you go through 2 stitches. And again, that is your matching decrease for the one that you've done on the other side. So that's the matching. And then you can see that you have 5 unworked stitches on the left as well, and they correspond to those on the right. That's really important and a very easy way to check after every purl row that you are right and that it is still in the center of your heel flap. So you slip purlwise with yarn in back this time, and then you knit your next 8 stitches. Now something to bear in mind here is that in some patterns you will see knit to 1 before the gap rather than giving you a specific stitch count, and all that is that is to take you to the last worked stitch of your flap of your turn, and then to the next unworked stitch. There's a gap between the worked and the unworked is there. So what you're going to do to bridge that gap then is you are going to do a slip slip knit to bridge it. And this is how you're doing the short rows in this. That's why there's no wrapping and turning or anything. They're just joining across the gap, slip slip knit, knit the 2 of those together as part of the knit, and then you have 4 unworked stitches on the left hand side. Then you turn your work, and then you're going to purl back. So you slip the yarn purlwise with the yarn in front, and then you purl 8. And again you may see the instruction purl to 1 before the gap, and again that's the worked stitch and the unworked stitches. So it's the gap between those is the gap that some patterns are talking about. So you can see it there. It's quite obvious where it is. And now you're going to purl those 2 stitches together to close that gap. And we'll just, you can see then as well that you have 4 and 4. And again, that is key. It tells you you're on the right track with the heel turn centered in the middle. If you manage to spend a lifetime knitting socks without veering off to one side, you'll be doing very well. I've definitely done it plenty of times, which just means rip back and start again. It's not something to fudge, I would suggest. So here we purl again, or sorry, slip purlwise and then knit 8, 1 before the gap, and then we're going to slip knit it again. Now we talked in the previous tutorial about reinforcing, and that does not go into the heel turn generally. But if the pattern needs you to do anything funny, it'll tell you. So that is 3 stitches unworked, and then we're going to slip 1 purlwise, purl back 8, and we're going to purl 2 together at the other side. Another note here is that this is a square heel turn. There are different shapes of heel turn, and the pattern you're following will tell you what to do. Some of them are more round, some are square. There are other heel turn types as well, using different types of short rows. And I'm going to go away and finish this until I'm on the last rows of the turn, and I'll show you how that looks then. So now you're onto the last row, and I just want to show you this. You've finished knitting you've just about to knit your 8th stitch. You're coming to the end, and you're going to slip knit, and in this one you're working the very last unworked stitch, and this is an indicator that you've finished your heel turn. So sometimes you'll see patterns and they will say work until all stitches have been worked, and that is what this means. My pattern doesn't tell you that, it'll tell you how many rows to work, but just in case you see differences in other patterns. Now we're going to slip 1 purlwise, and we're going to do the last purl row of the heel turn, working the last stitch on the left hand side. If you've been going evenly along, fingers crossed. So if you purl those 2 stitches together, there you are. You have now turned the heel of your work. It's a square heel turn, and you can see there that you have gone from being all the way around the back of your heel and under your foot. In the next tutorial we will cover the gusset pickup and shaping.